watching in the fellowship hall as well, and then we'll record this and share it. But come on in, make yourselves comfortable. If you're not warm enough, we'll make sure we turn the heat up. But we're glad to see all of you tonight. I'm just going to get us started, and I had written some really, I stole things off the internet about my friends that are here today. But I thought that we could share with each of you who is here today. But I wanted to start about why we have tonight's panel. And it started with just a fun idea to watch a movie. And then it turned into something else. And it turned into a more organic collaboration of friends that are gathered tonight. For those of you who are not familiar, today is actually the Japanese American Day of Remembrance. So it is the day that the Japanese Americans in 1941 got the memo, the Executive Order 9066, that they would be interned. And so 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned. But during that time, many found ways to challenge the system, but not with violence. Many did that, but they were incarcerated. But some did so by challenging it in different ways, by the law. Some did it by loving and protecting their country, by serving in the war. And then also many paid a great price for the generations to follow. And so February, we gather, it's also Black History Month. And so talking to my brothers here, we found a way to collaborate in an effort of Black and Asian solidarity, but also because of our own friendships with one another. Like Martin Luther King Jr.'s relationships with Mahatma Gandhi and Thich Nhat Hanh, with Frederick Douglass standing up for the Japanese and Chinese immigrants when he wrote the Composite Nation speech. Today, we come representing many different churches. And so I'm going to tell you about my friends. We come representing St. Mark's United Methodist Church, Inglewood First United Methodist Church, and Grace United Methodist Church, Holman United Methodist Church, and Faith United Methodist Church. And so as we come...
A lot of United Methodist churches.
A lot of United Methodists. We excluded all the other ecumenical churches. My bad. But as we come together, Pastor Gary, Pastor Victor, and myself, we come because we were excited to join together with our mentor, our collective mentor, the Reverend James Lawson. So we're glad you're here. We decided to have this panel conversation with a stretch on the topic of watching Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. And I said, Reverend Lawson, have you watched it? And he said, nope. But we have themes, though, that really resonate with what he's worked towards and also what we have been working to understand in today's society. And so today our topic is a stretch, but we wanted to help understand for younger generations, like my daughter, Kyra, who loves Grandpa Jim, but she doesn't know more than Black Panther being a superhero, right? And we've got Imani out there. And so we were wanting to talk about the movements of the civil rights era, ones that, had to fight, and using that word fight, what does that mean with words, with violence, however that came about. And so we wanted to talk about that and address that. We wanted to talk about nonviolent movements, and we wanted to talk about how we should be called to live as peacemakers today. So I'm going to start by introducing our friends. And next to me is the Reverend Dr. James Lawson, a retired United Methodist clergy. And so he served at Holman, where Pastors Gary, Victor, and myself were all associate pastors. And so he served as a mentor pastor for each of us as pastor emeritus there. And so James Morris Lawson, Jr., I love that you are, I believe, the 6th out of 9 children. Is that correct? Are you still remembering which one? 6 out of 12. Wikipedia is wrong, Reverend Lawson. So actually, and my husband Andy and I actually knew in seminary Phil very well because we were up in Berkeley, and so we worked a lot with him. So one of the 12. Reverend Lawson was, this is what it says, and I actually really liked it, so I copied it. He's an American activist and university professor, also pastor. He was a leading theoretician and tactician of nonviolence within the civil rights movement. Is that correct, sir? If you can hear, I'm going to put his microphone on so you can hear him. There we go. But as we gather, he'll tell you more about what he's done, but he's also, we know very intimately his family. We know his wife, Dorothy, and she's wonderful, and so she couldn't be with us tonight, but also his children and his grandchildren are friends of ours. And so as one of the things that I wanted to highlight, though, was that he was a Methodist missionary to Nagpur, India, and that is where he studied the nonviolence resistance developed by Mohandas Gandhi. And so this is why we really want to learn more. Wrong, Wikipedia. You better correct it for us tonight, sir. And you can take off your mask.
My nonviolence comes from my family as we resisted racial prejudice in Ohio. And Jesus of Nazareth has been the central figure of my nonviolence. And Jesus did not call it nonviolence. Gandhi called it nonviolence. And Jesus called it love, but it's Gandhi who said that love is powerful. It has many powers. It's the power of creation. It's the power of God. And that we should use love to overcome evil and do right. So.
I'm going to go into Wikipedia and change.
I'm
going to Wikipedia and changing all this and updating it for you.
And because Gandhi is from India, many of us in the Western world therefore thinks that does not matter, does not count. But it does, and it does count, and it does here tonight. No, we don't think that Africa, China, Asia, Latin America produced any religion of humanity that we need to listen to. So I mean, that's the reality. So.
Oh, they can't hear you, Reverend.
Well, anyway. Anyway, I don't want to talk that much, but let's see.
So I'll introduce then the rest of our panelists, and then we'll ask you and you all some questions. Next to me is the Reverend Victor Cyrus-Franklin. He's the lead pastor of Inglewood First UMC and of Grace United Methodist Church, co-pastoring. And so together with his co-pastor, we, I have my blank on Lisa's last name, Lisa Smith. And so he has served and has a passion for ministry that crosses racial, gender, and generational boundaries. And I love that this says that Victor follows Jesus toward wholeness, reconciliation, and justice. He is a native of Nashville, Tennessee, and received his bachelor's degree from Tennessee State University and the Master of Divinity from ITC, the Interdenominational Theological Center. And so as he shares more with you today, he also is very active in our California Pacific Annual Conference. His kids are a part of our Faith United Methodist Church youth group and our garden ministry, but now Nani is now one of our youth, so with MYF and TGIF. And so Trey and Nani are here in the other space. There's Trey's over there. And then we also want to recognize Victor's wife, Reverend Nima Cyrus-Franklin. She is an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian PCUSA and often works with my husband, Andy, which is very fun. And then on to the left of me is the Reverend Gary Bernard Williams. Pastor Gary is the lead pastor at St. Mark's United Methodist Church, and this is your description that I loved. A pastor, husband, father, friend, activist, and in recovery. South Central LA is his mission field. So a graduate of Claremont School of Theology and Cal State LA. And so Pastor Gary and I have known each other for a very long time. He's been a friend, an ally, a colleague in ministry, and co-conspirator in the best possible ways. He's passionate about congregational revitalization, spiritual transformation, community engagement, and children and youth mentorship. Pastor Gary is very involved in the CalPAC conference as well, and he currently serves on many different task forces, including our Justice and Compassion EMTs, as well as our Methodist Federation for Social Action.
What is an EMT?
An essential ministry team. That is our conference lingo for our bigger committees. But there are many groups that Pastor Gary is involved in, but I wanted to introduce you to his lovely wife, Ms. Myrna Williams, right there. She's over there, behind her. And then his lovely niece, Imani. You want to say hi, Imani? She good. And so as we join together, I'm going to invite, I'm going to pass this on to Pastor Victor and Gary to lead us into kind of just connecting the themes of tonight so that we can have a conversation. And we have some questions for you, Reverend Lawson. So can I turn over some of the themes of Black Panther to you all? For those of you who watched Wakanda Forever or the Black Panther movies, we had picked out some themes that we wanted to talk about. And why don't we just list some of the themes, or some of you might help us with some of the themes that you recognized if you saw the movies.
Yeah, so when we met, some of the things that we lifted up was one, there were two different groups, obviously, in the film, especially the Wakanda Forever film, and they were both indigenous, right? One from Africa, another Central America, or maybe even portions of South America. And so there was a miscommunication between them that led to a battle, a fight, a war between those two groups. But they all had shared root causes of their problems, which are connected to a history of colonialism. So that was one. Another theme connected to that, resolving their differences after being pitted against one another. And so since these were both indigenous communities, there was a question that we talked about in terms of our own experience here. Do you want to speak to that, Pastor Gary?
Do people know which land? Is that the one we're talking about?
Yeah.
Do we know whose land, indigenous people's land, that we are on now?
Do we know? I believe it's a Tongva.
Tongva
Yeah.
tribe.
Is it just a
All
Tongva?
right.
Gabrielino Tongva
Yeah.
tribe here. And so throughout Los Angeles County, I know I serve on a advisory committee for Care First Community Investment. Some of us remember Measure J. It was on the ballot for LA County a few years ago. So this was about funds being redistributed to fund alternatives to incarceration, investing in mental health services, investing in youth programming, investing in housing in Los Angeles County. And so when that committee meets bi-monthly, we always begin with a land acknowledgement. That's one of the commitments that the committee made, is when we talk about doing work that creates healing in Los Angeles County for Black indigenous folks, persons of color, let's begin by acknowledging the peoples whose lands we are on that was taken from them, and learn out how we create restoration in the work that we do.
I think that's a really good practice. We had a guest speaker today at our church, and that's the way she started off. is sharing, and I think it's just a really good practice for all of us, and it's a point of humility to respect the land who we now live on, whose land it really is, and acknowledge those people. Yeah.
For those who also watched the movie, there were other themes of grief and forgiveness. We talked about grief and loss and reconciliation. But there was a topic that we thought could bring it back to all of us. And so, Reverend Lawson, one of the topics was about resolving differences when we're pitted against each other. And brothers, you can respond to this as well. But we just watched this film where these two groups were pitted against each other, indigenous groups. But also, we wanted to talk about the confrontation of violence. And one of the themes that we saw was that we realized that the movie helped you realize that violence wasn't the answer. Like, you could fight, you could be hurting each other, harming one another, but it didn't get anywhere. And I don't know if you want to elaborate on that to ask Reverend Lawson our question, but we wanted to, you coined the term plantation capitalism when we talk about dividing and conquering other sub-ethnic groups. And so how does that play into the world that we live in today and the ones the experiences that you've had? You want them to clarify?
Well, all right. I'm very, very pleased to be here with my friends, Gary and Victor and Allison, and their families and friends. I'm delighted to see you all. I don't know how best to do with some of these issues, but it almost has to be said that since about the 15th century, the world has been organized or reorganized by the discovery, conquest, destructive period of Europe. The United States is the direct result of that, and the United States remains the most violent, largest empire that the human race has ever developed on this planet Earth. So that's my perspective.
Well, Reverend Lawson, I'm curious.
I'm not sure that we can go back to the 15th century. I think we have to deal with ourselves in the present moment, and that we have to try to dismantle as much of the wrong that we can see, especially in our own lives, because that's the beginning place for a better world, is a you who is essentially centered in God's will, God's love, God's creation, and is prepared to use the gift of life to be at least one life singularity that loves and therefore dismantles the wrong and tries to create at every level otherwise the kingdom of God on earth as within the context of your own life. And I am struck by the fact that Jesus did not preach salvation. And you will not find it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He did not preach salvation. He preached doing God's will. taking your life that God has given us and created, and then trying to do on earth God's will as it is in heaven. That's, of course, the great Jesus prayer.
So, speaking of the Lord's, as we call it, the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. What is it about violence that's so tempting for us as human beings? Violence to resolve our conflicts, violence to resolve. It seems like it's such a temptation for us that that's the way, because that's what happens in the film. You're lured into violent confrontation. And what is it about Jesus' message that gives us love and nonviolence as a better way?
Well, the very word violence comes from the word violate. So that violence is the use of power to intimidate, destroy, injure, kill a person or persons or villages or peoples. So violence, that's how, that was the definition years ago by the Center of Disease Control. That was their definition that I saw. So violence is the very opposite of life or of love. And Gandhi of India is the one who coined the term nonviolence. And nonviolence, as he coined it, is not putting the prefix non in front of violence. Gandhi took a Hindu concept called ahimsa, a concept that developed about 600 years before Jesus in what is called Jainism, which was the religion of his mother. And so Gandhi translates ahimsa as nonviolence, not a word with a hyphen in it. And he writes in his literature that the non is not a negative. So it doesn't mean not being violent. He said nonviolence is love in action, the power of God operative in your own life, the power of creation, and utilizing that power. So that's the way Gandhi is presented, and I came to that through Jesus of Nazareth, where clearly to me, Jesus is not just an apostle of love, but he's an apostle of love who should be called. We should talk. In addition to talking about Jesus as Christ, we should be talking about Jesus as the nonviolent God, the nonviolent prophet. And Christianity needs to purge itself. Almost all the armies and navies and bombs of Western world have on them in the name of Jesus. And we Christians need to take Jesus' name off all those weapons.
Yeah. Reverend Lawson, earlier you said that Jesus never talked about salvation, and when we talk in terms of salvation, we always talk about this individual thing that we have that separates us from others. And I think that's one reason why we don't understand, we don't study Gandhi, we don't understand other religions, because we think that we have the answer and it's salvation, and that we're the only ones that have the ticket
For those of you who read about Jesus, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, we have 4 extraordinary books. No other human being from human history has that many books written about his teachings as does Jesus. And nowhere in those books will you find, I am the Lord and Savior of the world. I have come to save you. Nowhere will you find in those books Jesus saying, I am going to die on the cross for your sins. You go search those books. Nowhere in the language from Jesus in those 4 books will you find some of the main things that Christianity has been saying. They are not there. And so Christianity has a pretty powerful role to play in straightening out the message if we expect to heal ourselves or the world in which we live.
How can we do that when the loudest voice in the room is the Christian nationalists?
Yeah. Well, remember now that in the movement of the 20th century, and I date the movement from 1953 to 1973. I will try to say this as quickly as I can. Number one, the civil rights movement is not the centerpiece of the engine of change in the United States. The civil rights movement is an umbrella term that includes many, many campaigns. The chief campaign of the civil rights movement of the 20th century is what the late Congressman John Lewis identified as the Nonviolent Movement of America, or the Movement of Love of America. I also call it the Rosa Parks Martin Luther King Campaign of America. And that movement, from my participation in it and continued study of it, I date as from 1953 to 1973, where we had things like the Freedom Ride of 1961, the sit-in campaign of 1960, the Mississippi Summer of '64, the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights Bill that was a product of 1965. So 1953 to 1973. The Head Start Bill of 64. The Medicare Bill of 65. Immigration is being fought. Well, you may not know that until 65 or 66. I'd have to look up the exact date. Immigration into the United States was an all-white immigration. The Immigration Bill of 1965 allowed Africa, Central America, Mexico, Asia to have visas for people who wanted to immigrate. So the all-white immigration, as when I say all white, only European countries could immigrate people into the United States until 1965. So part of the big battle over immigration is the fact that in the movement of 1953 to 57, we desegregated the visa system and internationalized it. So, and this was all done. So the nonviolent movement is a specific years of campaign. But the most important part of the civil rights movement is hardly ever acknowledged. That was May 14th, 1954, when the NAACP got the Supreme Court to unanimously declare that racism was unconstitutional. That's only 1954. And that's a part of the big, to take an injustice to court and legally use the court. The court can be a nonviolent tactic for social change. So that was 54.
Just kind of under that umbrella then, Reverend Lawson, maybe you can help some of us who only know surface value. You and I talked a little bit earlier about the Black nationalist movement. We talked about so the Black Panthers, or the Black liberation. Like, were these different movements in symphony with each other, or were they did they clash against each other? And how does that work with the nonviolent movement?
Yeah, well, these are all questions that are hardly getting talked about. And I have to say that the so-called Black nationalist movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Panther movement, are not movements that have come out of they do not come and did not come out of the movement that can be called the Niagara movement, the NAACP, or the Urban League, or the Black Church. Black nationalism is a direct process of white progressive thought or liberal thought. I hate to say liberal because I don't want to denounce what liberalism has helped to contribute. But I used to argue with, in the 60s, with Stokely Carmichael and with Charles Stewart and others who called themselves Black Power people and all. But that ideology did not come from the Negro spiritual or the slave movement, because that movement comes from Europe, 20th century so-called liberal progressive thought, as I've said. The black slave movement, and as I have tried to study it and understand it, very clearly did two things. First of all, the black slave was told he had to sing, she had to sing on the plantation, so that the white master would know where that slave was on the plantation. All right, the singing was forced, but what this meant is that the slave produced a musical literature that has never been matched. And the slave music did two things. One, it helped the slave to say, I'm not a slave, I'm a child of God. And there are literally hundreds of pieces of that music that are available in the written records. Slaves saying, I'm not a slave, I'm a child of God. And then next, the slave created the underground movement, which meant that slaves said, because I'm not a slave, I'm not going to stay here. So they fled into the Florida swamps, they fled into Mexico, they fled into Boston, they fled up to where my slave parents fled, my great-great-grandfather, into Guelph, Ontario. So the slave did what the human race has done. The human race has migrated constantly since its beginning to leave wrong so that they could go and live as they wanted to live somewhere else. So the slave music is, first of all, a definition that we are the children of God, and secondly, it uses flight and the Underground Railroad as a way of resistance.
So when thinking about reflecting on nonviolence and that, especially that period, you said it was 1953 to 1973, is that
Yes,
right?
that's what I taped, the heart of the nonviolent movement, 53 to 73.
So I listened to a podcast last week. Some of us watch MSNBC and Chris Hayes, right? But he did a podcast last week, and he interviewed Minnie Jean Brown from the Little Rock Nine.
Minnie Jean?
Yes. Yeah, I thought you might. Right, there you go. But you know, about her experience as a high school student, right, being one of the ones who they asked her. She said she wasn't chosen per se, but she was one of the ones who volunteered herself to desegregate Little Rock Central High School. Central High in Little Rock. And so, if you would, especially since a film like, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, is really to reach out to young people, younger generations. And when we talk about what is nonviolence in practice in living out this love? And I recall you telling a story about what you taught those young people then, and how, and based on this, and if you can fill in the rest of the gap of the story, but when you first met with them, you asked them what their parents taught them, what the organizers taught them, folks from the NAACP and other places, and they told you, well, they just told us not to fight back. But you said, what I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I recall was that was not one of the best things they could have told them in terms of what nonviolence is really about. Can you?
Well, in terms of human history, human life is about. Yes, I met all 9 of the Little Rock desegregation 56, 57. And actually, 85 black students, high school students in Little Rock, said, we'll go to Central High School, because their high school had no biology lab, no chemistry labs. It was an old building. Central High had a national reputation for its math and science. So all the black kids in Little Rock who wanted to be doctors and mathematicians and engineers wanted to go to Central where they could get those first grade classes. See? 85 black kids signed up to go to Central High. The federal court and the local white school board chose only 9. And the governor said no. So the White Citizens Council and the Ku Klux Klan And white parents all across Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Missouri said no. And literally, many of those white people went into Little Rock and were in the mobs. So that Dwight Eisenhower, the president, had to federalize the National Guard to stop the mob action against the desegregation of schools in Little Rock. But those 9 students, when I first met them on my first trip to Little Rock, told me that the NAACP lawyers and their parents have said, you may not fight back. And my response to them was, your parents and the NAACP, they mean by that, you must not fight back like they are fighting you. You must fight back with character, with love, with your minds, because how they fight you wants to continue racism and violence and brokenness. But your work moving into that school is an effort to get the desegregation of Little Rock schools. Now, that was fairly common in the 40s and 50s when Jackie Robinson was asked and recruited to desegregate baseball in 47. He was told by the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, you cannot get angry for the first year. If somebody spikes you in the first year, you cannot spike them back. You have to outplay them on the baseball field. You have to absolutely, because if you spike a white player, you will be kicked out of baseball. So if this is going to work, that's the unknown story very often. But it's true that oftentimes that's required in order to break something down, dismantle something.
So I was just thinking, it's 2023, and for the last few years, there's been a lot of anti-Asian hate and violence, a lot of anti-black Asian violence, and anger within the black community. So what do we tell young people now when the society in which we live is so violent and people want to protect themselves? What do we tell our young people when they see their elders being jumped on and abused in the streets and they want to push back? What do we say to them today?
Well, you have to make a choice about what you think life is about. You have to choose that God or creation has given you a single gift of life, and that it represents the most powerful forces of the universe. And you have to decide whether or not you're going to live by that, or whether you're going to live by how the nation has corrupted it. That's the choice you have to make. That's what Jesus means when in the book of the book of Matthew, the 5th chapter, he says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. That's fantastic. Christianity doesn't teach that often, but there it is. 5th chapter of Matthew. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And what that means is you have been endowed with the singularity of life. No matter where you are, who you are, if you think about it seriously, no one is made exactly like you. Yet you are 95% like every other human being on earth. That's a part of it. You have a different DNA, a different fingerprint, but you're like every 97%. The scientific world now says 97% of most of us, of all of us, are similar. Less than 5% is unique, but in that uniqueness is where you become who you are. So we have to encourage our children and young people to know that they have, that as far as we know, nowhere in the universe there's a person exactly like you, and you have to pick up your life and live it in such a fashion that your life can become more than conqueror, more than effective as a human being. And like a Jesus, that may mean that the human being is crucified by Roman Empire because Jesus clearly did not accept Roman theology. Caesar is not the Son of God. Jesus lived. Jesus insisted that God is God. And that actually Jesus insisted that no one can be God but God. So, anyway.
I love that you brought back the lectionary reading that many of us preached on. We did the Beatitudes, and then we did You Are the Light and You Are the Salt of the Earth. And I think you just gave us a reminder that we are all called, but we have to choose how to live that. And so I was, like, in a time before we open it up for any questions here, I was curious, like, in the same vein that Pastor Gary asked the question, you all love to teach and lead young people, but also anyone under the age of 100, right? Reverend Lawson. He still teaches at Northridge and UCLA. Each of you, we do our ministries not only in our own churches, but our communities. I was curious, like, why is it so important to teach this nonviolence or teach this God's love in the communities that we are serving in? And so I'd love to kind of leave that as the last question for each of you to answer, but then open it up to those friends here to ask questions. And as you can tell, the three of us love just to bombard Reverend Lawson with questions because we love listening to him. But we thank you. But how do you respond in your own communities to this teaching? Like, I see here Imani is here, Kyra's here, Trey is here, Amara's in the back, Evan was here. And so how are we, and is Nani here too? Nani's in the other room. Like, how do we continue to lead us? Nathan is here, we have young adults here. How do we have this spirit that we continue to live into of love, of nonviolent love?
Last night, I had to go and speak. I'm in recovery. And I had to go speak to a group, about 60 or 70 people. And before I spoke, they asked me to choose a song to come in on. And I chose Molly Music. It's Gonna Be All Right. And there's a line in there that says, "The love is the lens that I see you through." And that's super key for me, because on that same night before I spoke, I hadn't seen anything like this in years, but a fight broke out outside the meeting. And it was the ugliest thing I've seen in a long time. And it just really, it sickened me to see it. And just again, a reminder that violence is just ugly, and we continue to go down that path to solve problems. And so we need to make sure that the people that we teach, the people that we talk to, they understand that there's never an answer in violence. And we live in a society, in a world that is all about violence. But we have to continue to teach love and to see everybody through the lens of love. And that's the way that I'm really understanding it now for myself. I didn't always think like that, but that's...
How'd you used to think? No, I'm messing with you.
That's more for later.
Yeah. I'll just respond quickly. One important dimension of that love is the gift of imagination. Loving oneself, loving others enough to imagine a world beyond where we are now, where there is flourishing, where there is justice, where there is peace, where there is... And part of what violence robs us of is a sense of license to even imagine something beyond where we are now. I'm reminded, there's a novel called Push. It became a motion picture, Precious, written by Sapphire, who was a teacher in the public school system, a writing teacher, language arts teacher in New York City public schools. And one of the things she says is the young people who were able to resist the oppressions and the bigotry of growing up in underfunded schools and disenfranchised communities and violent and abusive, the traumas of the violence and abuses they encountered. He said it wasn't the ones who were the smartest, it wasn't the ones who were the most athletic, it wasn't the ones who had those types of gifts, but she said the ones who had the most imagination, the ones who could see themselves beyond that place and work toward that place individually and in community, was a manifestation of their love for themselves and their love for others and a love from God to strive for and fight for, those possibilities. Reminds me of, I remember in seminary someone did a lecture on Benjamin Elijah Mays, and who told the story of one of the folks who was involved in the Montgomery bus boycott. And they said for a time they were sitting at the back of the bus, but even when they were sitting on the bus, they imagined and saw themselves sitting in the front. So where their body was in a carceral state in terms of where they were forced to be, but in their mind and in their spirit, they never accepted that place that the world had impressed upon them. And that's what informed the courage and the creativity. How can we organize together to create another world for myself, for my children, for our children's children. And so much of that, so much of a manifestation of that love and the gift for our young people is the gift to imagine and the creativity that's rooted and grounded in love, that comes from that. So sometimes with young people, we want to keep them under tight control to protect them from a world that is violent. But in our support of them, we also ought never take away their imagination. Because they know they are loved when their imaginations, right, have freedom.
I might disagree with that. I don't know. I have to think.
Talk to me.
Yeah. As I was growing up in Ohio, Massillon, Ohio, I really don't remember doing that much imagination about my future. I don't remember that. I lived in a neighborhood in which black families were maybe only about 10% in the whole city of Massillon, Stark County. In my neighborhood, black and white families were on almost every block within a 5-mile radius. And the nearest school was a 1 through 9 school just up the hill, where all of us went to that school. I never saw the future that I can remember at age 4, age 5. At age 4, one of the white boys in our play group in the neighborhood, there were maybe 30 to 40 children in the neighborhood of about 5 blocks. We were playmates for everything. Summertime, school time, we went to the same school. And this neighborhood boy was my age, living in the same block. We were out together in an empty parking lot, or an empty house lot down at the end of the block where we lived. And he hauls off suddenly and throws, and verbally he shouts at me a racist epithet. And I hit him, age 4. I try to fight him. And he's a playmate. He's not a stranger. He lives in the same block where I live. I didn't tell my parents because my parents would not have liked it. My mother and father would have not wanted me to hit him or fight with him. I didn't do that until age 8 when I accidentally told my mother another incident. And she didn't get angry with me. She just let me know very clearly, you can't live that way. So I don't remember imagination being the important element. I did not imagine myself being an elder of the United Methodist Church at age 4 or 5 or 10.
I don't think I'm saying that. I think what I am saying is, for instance, the spiritual tradition is about a people who did not accept their condition and lot in life as enslaved people, and could imagine possibilities for themselves and their children beyond what a racist, bigoted, oppressed world was giving them. And so the songs, Reverend Lawson, so when we say, before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free, is about seeing possibilities beyond what's in front of them. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Martha, don't you roam. Pharaoh's army got drowned in the Red Sea. Is about seeing the possibilities of what could happen that are beyond the expectations that are placed upon them individually and as a people. So when I'm saying imagination, it's not about a personal trajectory for one's personal life and individually, but it is about, if we're fighting and co-creating a world that is better than the world that we have now, we have to see it before it exists. And that's really what I'm more pushing for, and nurturing that in our young people, because that is a seed of creativity. Howard Thurman, Creative Encounters, is so much of that creativity is tied to having a spirituality, I think, of imagination for what is possible in God despite what the world puts in front of us.
Well, I wrestle with that.
Fair enough. Jesus, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It exists in heaven. It's not here yet. That is a vision. That is a powerful vision of what God's reign is beyond the material conditions that currently exist.
But as I have used that prayer across my life, I've also added along the way in the prayer, beginning with me.
Yes.
Help me to do it. Let me find out how to do it and do it.
Yes, I'll
Howard Thurman, remember, is a theologian, perhaps in some ways the best theologian the United States produced in the 20th century. And Howard Thurman never talks about the gospel of Jesus. Howard Thurman always talks about the religion of Jesus. Because Howard Thurman thought very clearly that the gospel of Jesus was supporting slavery and racism. And he could not find that in Jesus in his reading of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, and I'm not sure that's as much imagination as it is in my own life. The call to follow Jesus meant that I didn't know what the future had in it. I say to this day, I try to live by a single breath at a time. Not really knowing much of anything except some degree of steadiness at this moment.
Indeed, you do.
Jesus' teaching and the teaching of the prophets is large enough and it is large enough that there are many different angles that we can see in it.
Yeah.
From which to work. There's no doubt
I can keep going. Let justice roll down like waters.
Mm-hmm.
Reverend Lawson.
What's that?
Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That's such a powerful vision to live into. I don't want to belabor
That's
the
a
point.
vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's, well, I'm very much of a justice man. Since the 1980s here in LA, I have worked with organizing working people who work and get no money. And I recall one of the early sessions way back in the 80s with Local 11, the hotel worker or the restaurant worker who said in one of our workshops, but I can't love the enemy. And I said, of course you can't. You can't really love the enemy until you love yourself and your family and your friends and your working people where you work, until you love who you are and your family and so forth. There's no way you will garner enough love to deal with the boss. That requires, first of all, acknowledging that no matter how bad the wages are or how bad the working condition is, that you are somebody and that you have to help take your somebodyness and transform that work site into representing you. So anyway, that's where, and that's nothing. That is nothing that I ever imagined in my life of work. In the first 25 or 30 years of my journey, I never imagined.
Bet you never imagined sitting here with all of us.
Yeah, lots of things I never imagined.
But you have given us a lot of hope and a lot of understanding. You're not the only one he's disagreed with. When I called Reverend Lawson to explain why we wanted to get him to share on a panel with us, I said, well, the new generation doesn't know about the Black Panthers, and they don't. And you said, I disagree, Allison, because it's the adult's job to teach and educate our young people. And that is why our children, our nieces are here, because this is our job to teach them what happened and teach them the history, and so it doesn't repeat itself again. But we wanted to open it up to if anyone wants to ask any questions to Reverend Lawson, to Pastor Victor, to Pastor Gary. Kyra can help take the microphone around. Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask?
Well, not just questions.
Yes,
you want to
yes.
make comments.
Or make a comment, actually,
If you
yes.
want to make a comment,
To comment,
make-
you can disagree
make a
with
comment.
any of us, too. And I'm going to give this to Kyra. Uncle Ben, right behind you.
Yeah, this is very enlightening. I want to thank you, Pastor Jim, and my brother pastors there, as well as my sister pastor here. I'm an old, worn-out pastor. My name is Ben Van Leeuwen, and it's very tempting to think that there is a pervasive bias against the marginalized population in American life. We would think that in 1864, when the when the forces of racism, forces of slavery were, fell in the fall of Richmond in 1864, that would have ended. As a matter of fact, I think that President Lincoln, when he was touring Richmond after the fall of Richmond, he was, hailed by our brothers, the blacks, as the savior, and they were kneeling before him, and he said, "No, you do not kneel before me, because it is God's gift. Freedom is a God's gift that you're going to be enjoying, you and your and the rest of the country." My question is, isn't it very tempting to think that in spite of the advances, in spite of 1954, and in spite of all the other victories, for inclusiveness in this country, there is still a pervasive, bias against the minority, that they do not belong to this country, and so the natural reaction would be violence. And I like Pastor Jim Lawson's contention that violence needs to be transformed and not just be pushed back. And I don't know how far we're moving along as a church or as a society here.
Anyone else?
Well, when you talk about violence in the United States, we people of the church need to acknowledge that our country is the most violent culture that the human race has ever known. We must stop pretending that somehow we, the people of the United States of America, have been an exceptional people. That simply is not true. In the killing that's been going across the country, I suspect that you have not seen any editorial that said, "Thou shalt not kill." And "thou shalt not kill" did not come from the Jews or the Christians. "Thou shalt not kill" came from early regions of the human race, long before the Ten Commandments. That's to be found in the literature of the human family. Thou shalt not kill. But I don't know if you, I don't look at enough news and whatnot, but I do read 2 papers, a couple of national news magazines, and there's been no articles that talks about "thou shalt not kill." Now, it's limited student. I'm a limited student. They'll do enough. But I have seen, heard no one talk about "thou shalt not kill." Maybe some of you have.
Be a good editorial to write. Are there other comments or questions?
I see a hand back here.
Monty,
Shy. Go ahead.
No? It's all good. Any other thoughts?
I want to understand, if I told someone walked up to me and said, "What is Black History Month?" what would I tell them? I mean, they actually are sincere and said to me, okay, not silly things, because I've heard some silly things before, but when they're actually sincere, how do you see myself not having a history of an African American? How do I tell them something intelligent for February?
So how do you explain Black History Month to someone who asks genuinely and sincerely, but don't understand it?
I mean, the simple version of it is to go back to its origins with Carter G. Woodson and Negro History Week, and his leadership to create a space for the telling of the stories of Black contributions to the United States. But also, I mean, similar things happen around the world. I mean, you can go to countries in Europe and South America, and there are versions of this, and then eventually grew, into a month. I think sometimes when that question comes, my interpretation of it, sometimes from the person's asking, is there anything worthy of sharing and telling? And I think that's also a question that's not just for people of African descent and Black folks in this country and in the diaspora. But similar questions will come when we talk about Latinx communities, Asian American communities, Japanese communities. Because there are folks from, when we talk about the Japanese Day of Remembrance, that's not history that folks from where I'm from are aware of. But it's essential to understand, to know the shared struggle that we are in together for healing of us all and toward living into a new heaven and a new earth. And so I would affirm, I mean, frankly, even first, our church council chairperson from Inglewood is here today, Melissa Arnold, right? And so part of what we did in worship this morning was she gave the message today telling the story of the Garifuna peoples of Belize. That is an indigenous, black indigenous community there in Belize. Coming from where I'm from, I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. I have Nashville on my back, right? Because that's where I'm from. We didn't hear about that heritage, but it's a rich heritage of who we are. And so the more we learn, the more we appreciate our connection as human beings. So in the particulars, it points to the universal of who we all are as human beings. So that's why I would say, that's why Black history is important, but that's why the history of every people is important, especially those of us for whom our stories have been either marginalized or been told that they have no value or contribution to the world when they absolutely do.
I just want to maybe add that we live in a society that's centered around European history and white civilization, and throughout school we didn't learn any of this, and to be here today on a Japanese Day of Remembrance is something that I was never taught that. I didn't know anything about Black history until somebody gave me a book after I came out of elementary school, because we never learned anything about who I am and my culture. And you see the pushback now in white society is pushing back against history being taught, pulling books off the shelves because they don't want the truth. You know, the dominant society is feeling like they're being encroached upon by the others.
My brother, can I?
Go right here, sir.
Again, where I'm from, in Nashville, state of Tennessee, there's a John Lewis Boulevard named for the late Representative John Lewis, who with Nashville roots and connections, because it was his leadership as a college student there at Fisk University with Reverend Lawson to desegregate downtown Nashville. So there's a street there in downtown Nashville named after Representative John Lewis. A bill was submitted by 2 state legislators in the state of Tennessee to change the name of John Lewis Boulevard to Donald J. Trump Boulevard. So when you say that, so when we ask what's the importance of this history, there is a concerted effort for a type of erasure, because it's about not only addressing the injustice, but creating a world that is really for the freedom, justice, and liberation of all people. You know,
we, the people of color, need to recognize, as never before, that our lives, in many ways, are in jeopardy. January 6th, 2020, tens of thousands of people descended upon the Capitol building of the United States and stormed it. That, by the evidence, has been called an insurrection against the United States of America. Over 900 people have so far been arrested in that, but there are many, many more who have not yet been arrested. Nancy Pelosi, when the Congress would not do it, appointed a select committee to study that January the 6th event. It's a big volume. I have it on my night table looking at it and reading it. But it was an effort to overthrow the Constitution of the United States and the 2020 election. That attempt was engineered by Donald J. Trump. And the introduction to the book says that, spells it out, in 8 different ways. That insurrection, which was called by Donald J. Trump, the president at the time, the crowd was called together by Donald J. Trump by internet, Facebook, by letters, by phone calls. In 8 different ways, Donald J. Trump tried to overthrow the 2020 election so that he could stay in office. 8, I mean, I listened to some of the daily stuff and the public hearings of things, but buying the book and trying to wander through it. 8 different ways that they demonstrate in the book how the President of the United States tried to overthrow the 2020 election. We ordinary people can do with that what we will, but if our court system and the Justice Department cannot get some of the major voices who did that and charge them, some of them are charged, but if Donald Trump goes scot-free, then you need to know full well, or we need to know, our children and our grandchildren and our grandchildren will suffer for it. If he gets away with it, he and his people, you and I need to be very, very, very careful about that.
I see 2 questions, and then we'll close it. Let's do Auntie Chris and then Auntie Karen, okay, Kyra? So Auntie Chris is right here.
Thank you all for being here. 4 distinguished people sitting up there. I want to ask, oh yeah, each of you are. I want to ask you all, because we live in such tough times, and each of us have a responsibility in this room. What would you advise to us in terms of spreading love to everybody? Sometimes it's really difficult to just talk about God's word to others who do not understand. But how could we demonstrate the love and positivity so that the world gets to be a better place? Each of us, what is our responsibility? What would you advise for us? That's what I'd like to know. You've had so much experience. I'm sure it's like 1,000 years among you. You know, a word of advice is what I would want.
I think what we're doing tonight is something, if we did more of this, would be the start. We've known each other for a long time, but for us to be in this space tonight, this is something unusual. This is not something that we do on a regular basis. You know, I think this is how we begin to spread love, by having these conversations and being able to be together in fellowship like this. This is the beginning, I think.
I guess maybe one simple approach is to operate under the assumption that we are all fearfully and wonderfully made children of God. Even the ones that we don't like. But we all have a spark of the divine and creation in us. And if we relate to one another from that place, that is a place of love. We had this afternoon at the Grace Church, we had a panel discussion on, a gentleman wrote a book called I Wish My Dad, and it's about vulnerable conversations that are needed between fathers and sons and mentors and mentees. And so one of the things we talked about as we wrapped up that panel was we oftentimes in the church, we use language about a God who looks beyond our faults and sees our needs, and through spiritual disciplines, I believe we're able, and with sanctified vision, see one another in such a way where we can, even with the challenges that we have with one another, ultimately inside of you is a divine spark, and I think that can help us be on the path and the journey toward loving one another. So that's one. So, yeah.
I want to thank you all for this space and forum. I agree, we need more sessions like this to get educated. And I was just wondering, like the media, a lot of, I know, like my kids, younger people don't seem to watch it. People feel slanted or biased, but I was just curious on what you all like watch to get educated. I'm retired now with my husband. He loves to watch the news. And so I just thought, I'm always looking for like, what's the best way to spend our time, or what, just curious on what you all like tune into.
What are your practices of news reading? Where do you get your news? Not Fox, sorry.
Reverend Lawson, you probably don't even remember this, but something that touched me, you said this I don't even know how many years ago, way before I came to Holman. We were somewhere, some gathering, and you were telling us that we need to find other means of finding news, alternative news, not just the main news, but find different versions of the news from different perspectives. So, because you can't get the whole story when I just watch MSNBC, because I watch that, and you can't get the whole story from any one of these, CNN or that other thing that I definitely don't watch, because I get a headache just even going by that channel, But yeah, we have to find other means to find sources that, give us a broader perspective. You remember saying that? You remember saying that? Do you remember saying that? That was about 30 years ago. It was a long time ago, man. But you did. You told us to find other sources of news. Don't just get stuck on the mainstream news story, but find alternatives. You said that a long time ago. Mm-hmm. You did.
Didn't you used to have a TV show, a radio show or a TV show, Reverend Lawson, at one point?
Did you have a radio show or TV show at one point?
Did I do what?
Did you have a radio show or a TV show that you spoke on a regular, other than home and worship services?
Oh yeah, I had, well, I went to a high school where I was early on assigned to go to the public library and read the magazines and newspapers. So I continue to read the Sunday New York Times, or pick up the daily, and I continue to read the Los Angeles Times. And I pick up magazines like the New Yorker or the Atlantic or the Harper's Magazine. I subscribe to Christian Century and the Sojourn Magazine, all of which have alternative sources about the same stories. So I don't read as much as I used to. I've got one. I don't read as much as I used to, but I continue to read. And I surf news commentaries, CNN, local news, and MSNBC. Occasionally I surf a national news broadcast, television. I don't listen as much to the radio as I once did. But we do have to get alternative sources.
Might expose my politics. I watch Democracy Now! Too.
Yeah, that's a pretty good one today.
And for those of you who are into technology and Apple phones, you can program all of the news alerts, and so I get a lot of my alert news because I've selected certain magazines and publications so that it'll come out. The LA Times will come out, the New York Times, Atlantic. And so I think that's one way for a lot of people to stay informed, especially if they're on their devices all the time. I don't watch a lot of TV news. I don't watch Fox or MSNBC a lot unless I see something pop up. But I do listen to the radio and NPR a lot as well.
I was going to say, my radio in my car is tuned to 89.3 KPCC because I get stories that I would never hear anywhere else there. Yeah.
Well, it looks like it is time for us to close, get your bellies fed, and go off for the evening. It's been a long Sunday for many of you, many of us. Since we invoked John Lewis's name several times, John Lewis he always said to pray. When you pray with your feet. So I'm going to invite you to stand and make that a movement and an action. But as we pray ourselves out, I will pass the mic on. I was like, gosh, I have 3 brothers I could pass the mic on to pray for us tonight. But Reverend Lawson, will you do us the honors and give us a final blessing? Yes. Oh, yes, Brian.
One last comment. Proper term is actually Japanese American Day of Remembrance.
Yes,
Not Japanese.
that is correct. It's the Japanese American Day of Remembrance. Will you pray us out, Reverend Lawson? But I got everybody on their feet, so we're going to pray. Either way. There you go. I got you.
No.
All right.
No. Let me do it.
You bet. All right.
Well, I want to thank my colleagues, Gary, Victor, Allison, for pulling this group together. I think that's important. It's important that we have these kinds of conversations. And I appreciate the work they continue to do. So I appreciate you who've come to help support that work. These are tough days, and we of the churches need to hang together in various ways so that we can be the leaven that God has to have in our world. O living God, in whom we, each of us here, and our families and friends and neighbors and congregations, in whom you, living one, in whom we live and move and do our behaving and our misbehaving. We're grateful that we could gather this evening as your people. And we are mindful of your presence and mindful of why we are here. We pray that the injustices of the past, the spiritual forces of wickedness, can be confronted by each of us in our own lives and reject it, and that instead we promote your kingdom on earth in us as well as it is in the universes of our time. We would remember every single family represented here and all the families that we love, with whom we are associated in a multiplicity of ways, that in the intimacy of family, we may experience your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven and be made strong in your grace and truth. Be thou with every single family represented